Welcome to Lit Discussions. I am Tarrell Campbell.
And I'm Nick.
We are here today with Author Ron Austin, author of Avery Coat is a Snake, a Thief, and a Liar. Avery Coat is a Snake, a Thief, a Liar. How you doing today, Ron?
I'm doing good. It's a Saturday. I can't complain too much on Saturdays, even though I might want to, but it's, the sun's out. The weather's not too bad, so it's a good day.
Okay.
Welcome.
Nick and I certainly have some questions for you. Before we get deep into the book, can I just ask you, who is Avery Coat? What is the book about?
So essentially, that's always kind of a tough question, only because I don't have a really strong elevator pitch. I should have an elevator pitch by now, but generally when I sit down and write and try to pursue something, I'm just kind of chasing after a certain mood, and within that, as far as who Avery Coat is, I'm using a persona to investigate certain situations and also memories and environments. So I would say that if I were to say who Avery Coat is, and especially in relation to me, he's kind of that part of me that's trying to search and reconfigure certain elements of the past in order to figure out what the path is forward to the future. And he's also kind of a representation of things that I fear that I could forget. So in a sense, when I sit down, I'm a certain type of person in that when I sit down and write, I don't really know what I'm thinking, and I really don't know what I'm thinking or what's going on with me internally until I try to write it down. So in that way, every time I write a new project, it is always an act of exploration that teaches me something, and any product that I produce, it's a way to anchor an emotion or an experience or a thought to a concrete place, so that I can come back and revisit it. So I mean, honestly, I don't know who Avery Coat is. It sounded like a good name. I started working with the character, and he took his own path. And the interesting thing is I think that over time he'll probably tell me more of who he is than I could ever tell him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about who Ron is? Who is Ron, so that we might have some insight into who Avery is. Avery seems to traverse the terrain of North St. Louis pretty much throughout the novel. Or are you a product of North St. Louis?
Yes, born and raised. So I grew up in North St. Louis, near the St. Louis Avenue area. It used to be called the Ville. So my grandparents, they owned a couple of businesses in the area where Vashon High School is currently. So they had a corner store and they had a laundromat. And so one thing that's interesting, and it's kind of the spine of the book, is considering how the grandmother and the grandfather in the book itself, they have their corner market. And when I was a kid, when I was growing up and we had our corner store, it was just a place where you have to go and do chores, and you just have to spend your summers there because your parents are working. It wasn't until I got older and I started to reflect and think about it, how important the corner store was to me, but not only to me, but to the community in general. And so whenever I started thinking about that and thinking that I wanted to write about it, I wanted to pair up the progress and then also sort of the erosion of the corner store with what was going on with the neighborhood at large, and kind of using that as a framework. So that's in part. It's interesting when you're growing up and you're looking at the world that's around you. It's really easy to think that everybody has a similar experience as you, that things that you think are just normal facts of life are shared by everybody. But then, you get past the boundary of your neighborhood and you start to see that people have different values, they have different viewpoints of normalcy, and it's kind of interesting to investigate those boundaries and intersection and see where you are the same and where you're different. And then that can also be a way to investigate society at large, thinking like, why, if I come from this area, I might have a certain viewpoint here and I relate to people in this way, whereas if somebody lives 10 minutes away, it might be completely different.
That's interesting, because Tarrell and I were just talking about love.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking about, you know, things that we saw in the book, and he said that, you know, in the community.
Hold on, y'all, for 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a key.
I'm trying to remember how you described the community. You said loving, and what else did you say, Tarrell?
Well, the community is, let us get into this.
You said there was a lot of love, and there was something else you said.
Well, before, when we broke off a little bit there, we were talking about the importance of corner stores to communities, particularly in Avery Cope. Before we get into the role of community and so on and so forth, why don't we just take a step back and describe the landscape of the novel here, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have a family dynamic going on with I guess the Cope family, right? We have Avery. He's the younger of 2 siblings. He has an older sister. She goes by Yale in the novel. Her name is Danielle.
Mm-hmm.
They live in the home with their mother Cheryl, right? And I'm not quite sure if Granddad and Grandmom are in the same home with Avery, or if they live downstairs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so but what we have here is we have the Cope family, or members of the Cope family, represented intergenerationally here, right? All the way from the grandparents to the parents Cheryl, to the kids Avery and Yale, right?
Mm-hmm.
So and they live in North City, St. Louis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the landscape of the novel. Now, Nick, you were about to pose a question about love and community and how those relate in the novel.
When you and I were talking about it, we were trying to describe the community, and you described it. You said that there was love there.
Mm-hmm.
And in relation to what he was saying, I said, love where? And when you talk about people seeing things differently, depending on where you're from, or where, you know, people live 10 minutes away, see things differently. Can you talk more about the sense of normalcy that you were talking about?
Well, I think it is interesting to talk about the concepts of love and warmth, and that'll connect to the sense of normalcy as well. So I think one of the main threads or interpretations that can be taken out of the collection is approaching the sense of love, and part of me wants to say tough love, but I think it's truer just to say love itself can be connected to survival.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in a community, or if you're within a family where there's the consideration that considering your local environment or even just the world at large, you might have to fight harder just to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that you're being taught and shown, it might be in connection to that somebody wants you to be able to make it. They want to show you the lessons the best they can that show you how to survive. And in some ways, they might be hard lessons, and they might, the important lessons, they might be taught to you in a way that could be jarring, that could seem problematic, but the fact that somebody's taking the time to show you that concern, that they're showing that there's a certain urgency to you figuring things out quickly, I think that's one side of love, and it's its own kind of nurturing. Even if some of those survival strategies are maladaptive, it's still a survival strategy, and that's better than not having any of that framework at all.
Is there, can you describe a scene like that, or in the book in particular?
So I would say, well, I mean, that's a lot of
or
the
a
scenes.
relationship, a relationship that's similar to what you said.
I would say maybe we could look at the first story and then also the impetus for the first story. So going back to the corner store that my grandparents owned, in the front matter of the book, you actually have a news clipping from the time where my grandfather actually had to fight off some robbers. And so that was part of the impetus of that. I was thinking about even if in your family somebody, or if in somebody's family someone owned a business, maybe you have security, or maybe you had to call the police one time, but it might not be like a normal thing that somebody would have to physically fight to defend their storefront. And so this was something that was normal to me. I grew up with this understanding that if you own some property, you just might have to fight some people, and that was a regular thing. And it wasn't until I was older where I was just like, well, maybe not. That's not maybe normal across the board. But even at that, and seeing that level of violence from a young age, that was something that set an example. And so I have a different relationship with an understanding of what might be necessary violence than what other folks might have. And so that's the thing where, like, that could be an example of where somebody is teaching you something about survival. It's difficult to say, like, you might have to hurt people within your life in order to continue to have a life. And that's a hard thing to hear, especially from an early age. But that's not being shown to you to disturb you or to disrupt you. It's just, this is the fact of the matter, and you have to understand it sooner than later.
I wanted to ask a question about Granddad. Granddad is represented in the novel. Granddad seems to be a repository of knowledge, of knowledge that Avery has yet to tap into. He seems to come from a different time and a different place. Can you speak on what you were trying to do with the representation of Granddad juxtaposed against a character like Avery? I mean, Granddad dishes out country ass whoopings, right? Granddad, I think there's a line in the novel where Granddad's country ass whoopings beat people into being, right? So that line keeps dancing around in my head because I'm trying to figure out these magical, mystical qualities of Granddad. He's phenomenal, like really along the lines of phenomenology. Like, one of his ass whoopings will make you exist. Like, it will bring you into this thing, right? And he's beautifully juxtaposed against Avery's dad, who he doesn't bring into existence, he takes away, right? Like, he takes away from Cheryl to the point that where she's almost a broken woman having to go and support the family, right? Right. So can you talk about Granddad and what his role is in the novel and what he means to Avery?
Sure. So I think as like his portrayal as being mythical, I think that kind of connects to his place in the family as being a big support beam. And then also the view that Avery takes of him at a very early age, that he looms larger than life. And in connection to the other characters, especially the other male characters, there's a sense of like that Granddad expresses one kind of survival strategy, and then the father might express another kind of survival strategy, and then Avery has to figure out what's kind of the good and bad that I can take from these things. But with the Granddad in particular, especially with his relation to violence, there's a sense of, like, there's that line of what's necessary to defend yourself and your family, and then also at which point do you need to figure out a different strategy to connect the community? How is violence something that isolates people from each other? And so as the grandfather progresses through the story collection, from his work ethic and also to the way that he literally fights for his family, you start to see that this mythical image, by the time we get to the story Cut Open the Vein, where Avery and the family are reflecting on his passing, the goal of that story was to show how, he's already humanized, because you understand that he's there are hints to that he's mortal just like everybody else. He's just trying his hardest to keep everything together. But reflecting back on some of those stories of him fighting, you kind of get a sense that him hurting other people hurts him in a certain way. And even though he has a lot of knowledge to share, and he seems like he does have this knowledge, maybe Avery's like afraid to approach him, but there's not like a lot of intimacy between him and Avery. And so it's kind of, I was looking to create a contrast between the two, and that Granddad is a person that just goes out and gets it done, and these are just the facts of the matter, whereas Avery is still trying to figure out things, and he's more considerate, and he has to figure out whether or not he can actually do what Granddad does, if he can shut off that part of himself that would think about other people and perhaps the consequences. If he could move out of this gray area into more like black and white thinking, which by the end of the collection, it might seem that it's something that he's not capable of.
Well, that's interesting, because I was almost to a point to where I was privileging Granddad's representation, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems to me what you're saying is that there's not so much a privileging of him, because he has his not so good sides and not so good qualities as well, right? As much as he might represent some wisdom and so on and so forth, he's somewhat unapproachable for Avery, right? Which really kind of brings to mind the episode where Avery is trying to be intimate with his dad, right? Mm-hmm. Where he's trying to catch the bus with him down to the gambling casino. It seems that, and I came away thinking that Dad was a less positive representation of masculinity as compared to Granddad. Mm-hmm. But when you bring up this intimate space, right, and when we always talk about our black boys and representations of our black boys, there's usually not a lot of space for intimacy and softness and things of that sort. So when I look at it through that lens, I do see the problematic in the relationship with Granddad, and that does open more fertile ground for the attempted relationship with Dad. As bad or as absent as Dad may seem at times, there does seem, at least Avery does at least seem to recognize a space to try to be more intimate with Dad, but I'm not quite sure that ever takes place with Granddad in the book. Mm-hmm. Right? Okay.
And there's also kind of another subject I'm facing too, is the topic of being an African American person just trying to hold down a regular job, which is something I'm still thinking about, because even if you take Granddad and you take the father, they're both working the best way they know how. And you could even apply that to the rest of the characters, is that they're all trying to use what they have in hand to get by. And with the father in particular, you see that he's trying to enter the professional world, or he's tried to, but some things aren't clicking quite right for him. And in the stories where it features Avery and his father, you get kind of a sense that Avery, the family's trying to push and trying to groom Avery to be able to survive in the mainstream world. Mm-hmm. But that's a very difficult thing to do. And the father and then the mother, they're trying to figure it out, and they're trying to navigate it the best they can. But it's just a new territory to them. So it's kind of, it's interesting, because at any one point, any character could be favored as far as the way that they're pursuing how to take the next step. But it's kind of like there's a certain amount of sympathy to have for all the characters, because they just reach a point where they just don't know what to do next. And so that can kind of cause some confusion and frustration, and a lot of missteps that have to be worked out later.
That's even how the book ends, in him not really knowing what to do next. You talked earlier about the necessary violence, which I found interesting, because you talked about it in reference to you having to defend your property, or your own person. But in the book we see a lot of corporal punishment. Mm-hmm. and I'm trying to find its place as necessary, as Black people, right, in our the way that we have to function as far as authority and police, and how they kind of had to make us subject to them, or make us take the authority over us, because if they didn't beat us, the police will. If you've never heard that, can you talk about corporal punishment and the spankings and the whippings in the book?
Well, so I would exactly what you said. If they don't beat us, the police will. So there's a sense of that. A lot of the control, it's coming out of a sense of urgency. That if I have to figure out a way to make you listen to me and understand this is important, and this is the quickest way to make that happen. I need you to be able to respect and also fear me so that I can get these results as quickly as possible, because if you step out of line in the wrong place, that could be consequences for everybody. So it's in that sense, and there's also an aspect of attempting to make somebody tougher. So exhibiting a certain amount of, say, even coldness or cruelty or hostility within your own home or community. Sometimes the idea is that if you can survive this, then you can go and survive other things. You understand. Also, in a way that might not be the best way or might be maladaptive, you understand particular boundaries. And one way to put it, and sometimes, and I always kind of make a joke about it, but sometimes I feel like in everyday life, folks can be unnecessarily disrespectful or even just kind of mean or passive aggressive towards each other. And I always think like, man, if they had more fights regularly, or if you were really afraid of being physically harmed in a way, you might move a bit differently. And I understand that there is that there's something to investigate there, and I don't seriously think that, people should have duels on the sidewalk and things like that. But it is also something to consider that as far as corporal punishment, in the long term, I don't think it's effective. I don't think it's the best way to move forward. But at the same time, I think that it is a tool that folks are familiar with, and it can get out of hand. But I think that the root of it is in the sense of like, this is one way to get people to listen, and the people that you need to protect, how do you get them to listen?
I want to talk about a sense of St. Louis history that you seem to bring to the novel. I particularly want to talk about the race riot at Fairground Park. This is part of St. Louis's history that is not mentioned often, is actually often hidden away. Talk to me about why you felt a need to discuss this aspect of St. Louis history in the novel.
A lot of the pursuit of history begins organically with me, in the sense that I don't think necessarily like, let me think about this big topic to explore. It's more so I think about the surroundings and the environment I grew up in, and thinking about the history of those specific places that you grow up catching the bus or riding your bike, and I would ride my bike through Fairgrounds Park, and you have kind of like the facade of the old bear pit. I didn't even know what that was. It just looked cool, so you get used to seeing those structures, the old water tower. That's one of my favorite things, because I just like the way that it kind of like breaks across the horizon, and it's almost like a comforting thing to see. Like when I think of my neighborhood, I think of the old water tower. There used to be even a old plastic factory that was across from my street. So even something like that's just something that I grew up with in the landscape. So whenever I visit the neighborhood in my head, or whenever I go back home and explore, I think of these places just as far as their relation to me. So then as I was writing and I was doing some more exploration there, I started to become curious more so about the history of each place. And so from that point, that's where I started to explore certain historical events in certain places with more intention. and a little bit more earnestly. And so that also plays into my attempt of that. Early on in drafting the story collection, one concern that I had is that if I'm following one character in a first person perspective, there's a certain amount of limitation there as far as the perspective you get. So I was trying to figure out different ways in which I could use that as an entry point, but also explore the community and the history. So, because my end goal is, I would want folks to follow Avery, but I want them to follow Avery in the sense of that they see his efforts to understand the community and the world around him. And so when I come to a moment in history, it's a way to frame the community against the city of St. Louis at large. And also the sense of the thread of trying to understand violence, understanding how an African American person might make their way through mainstream communities at large. Some of those intersections, especially the ones where there might have been a violent interaction, they're of particular interest. Not so much for the violence or the content there, but for the misunderstanding. Like, where was there miscommunication? Where was there a failure for people to connect? And then what was the aftermath there? And it's because it's interesting. Whenever I went to study English, I went to St. Louis University, and St. Louis University is about a 20-minute walk from the house that I grew up in. So sometimes I catch the bus, sometimes I walk home. And I always remember walking toward Grand Center in St. Louis University, and I would walk, and Grand Center, it has a lot of art installations. You got Powell Symphony, you got the Fox, the SLU campus is very well maintained. You got the church there, so it's kind of, there's a lot of kind of grandeur to look at. It's almost majestic walking toward Grand Center, which 5 minutes drive, 20-minute walk. That's not far from where I grew up. When I would turn around and I would walk home, then I would see it's still familiar to me. It's still home, but I see like the old plastics factory. It's like, okay, well, we got Fox Theater over here, but we got an old plastics factory over here. Like, what happened? And I was crossing the Delmar Divide, which I didn't even. So that connects back to the history. I didn't know, like, I didn't do research and say, like, this is the Delmar Divide and this is what happens. It's just something that naturally I'm like, there's something happening here. I don't know what it is or why it is. And so in writing and in pursuing something organically, at a certain point, if I get to some kind of interesting history I can explore, I try to incorporate that as well.
Can we talk about the cover?
Oh yeah.
It looks like a graphic design novel. How did you come up with the concept for the cover?
So I've always enjoyed reading and I've always enjoyed writing. But one of the main things that got me into reading was comic books. So my uncle, he was an avid comic book collector, and for some reason he left a lot of his old comic books at home in our attic. So he had these kind of like old mailboxes just full of like DC, Marvel, just whatever kind of comic book you could want. So I'd go up to the attic a lot when I was a kid and I'd read the comic books. So as far as my path into reading and writing, like kind of just the narratives that you see in a comic book, that's a big influence. And so when I was putting together the story collection, there's The Gatecrasher of Hyboria. That story specifically has to do with Avery reading those comic books. Mm-hmm. And even the incident that is kind of like the impetus of that story. I think I was in 5th grade, and I didn't like reading any of the books that we had for our curriculum. But the thing of it is I would show up to class and I would have like my own fantasy novels and comic books, but I didn't read any of the classwork. And so I started to flunk from the reading requirement, and the teachers really thought I couldn't read, but I would show up with books to read. So it turned into a whole thing. They demoted me to a different class, and I didn't read the stuff for that class, and then I ultimately had to take a test to determine my reading level. I took the test. I scored very, very high, and that was the whole thing. So I was thinking about that moment in time, and also like what that says as far as like perceptions and things that you need to be aware of when you're moving forward in the world. But that's all to say, I really enjoy comic books. They were a big part of my childhood, and I thought it would be an interesting motif to use for the cover. And in the cover itself, the different panels, they're different scenes from the stories.
Right. I'm going to ask you why you chose these particular ones.
So
we have the possum.
Yeah.
We have
chain.
We have the chain. We have the fish jumping, the catfish jumping out. We have you riding, I'm guessing, from the junkyard, maybe. We have the bullets from Granddad's gun, right? I'm guessing this is you going into the garden, into the community garden at night, under night, right? We have up here in the top right-hand corner the recipes with the finely dressed pig, right? So how did you decide upon these panels?
It was kind of a mix of the story moments that I thought were the most compelling, but also maybe they're more like personally sentimental to me. So for instance, my favorite image is of the catfish jumping out of the bucket. Because my grandfather would go and fish, he'd catch fish and he'd take them back to the corner market, and my grandmother would fry them up and sell them. So like I have memories specifically of trying to like dig up worms to go fishing, of them preparing fish, and just how being able to like catch this fish and then sell it, that's a sign of prosperity and maybe even hope. So that's like an important image to see for me. And things like riding my bike through the neighborhood, I really liked doing that when I was younger. So I was trying to mix like maybe scenes that or moments that were more tense with moments that were more, well, I mean, I guess like maybe just have a mixture of like, because you know, from day to day you could have a good day. You could have a day where, you know, someone catches some fish.
There are good days in the hood, right?
Yeah, exactly. You know, so I wanted to have that sense of like, to be like truthful in the representation, and to have some moments of like positivity, but then also mix it with the truth that like there could be danger around the corner too. And then that also something that like pairs up with a sense of like comic book narratives.
Along the same lines of the cover, can you talk to us about how do we describe them? The illustrations that populate the novel. You know, things like your sister's note, things like your mother's equation.
That was my favorite.
Your mother's equation of the outcome for her sister. How did you decide upon the use of illustration? Was that also along the lines of your comic book interest, or how did you decide upon the use of illustrations and how they would further the narrative along?
I like the use of small illustrations. It's something that you can see from young adult novels all the way up to postmodern literary novels. So I kind of I always just wanted to use those techniques because I really enjoy visual storytelling, and so whenever I found an opportunity in which I could include a visual or some kind of like something that seems like found text, if I could incorporate it and have it fit into the story, I really it wasn't like one of my main goals, but it was a way to. It kind of breaks the fourth wall a little bit, and in a sense, it can make it feel like more intimate to the reader. So even something like in Gatecrasher at Phiboria, when we have the letter written on the back of a gas station receipt, I was working in those elements just so that the reader could break up the text, so I could do a little bit of experimentation, and so that it could pull the reader a little bit closer.
I like that you could see through the receipt to the like printed receipt material on the other side.
Yeah, I actually, because I had to, I don't think I had any, I don't save receipts from my childhood, but I went to a gas station. I was like, it has to be the right kind of gas station, and I have to buy the right kinds of things if anybody were to see through and like see. So I made it a point to buy some snacks, and I think I might have like rubbed a little bit of like Cheeto grease or something on there before I scanned it.
No, go ahead.
No, along the same lines of the history. I mean, as a St. Louis native and also a graduate of St. Louis University along with Nick, I really appreciated the local color that the novel exudes. And I was impressed with the use of stuff like the First MB Church. Right? This was a location of the Underground Railroad at one point in time in St. Louis. So the little nuggets that you hit upon with respect to St. Louis history and St. Louis lore, particularly with respect to African American communities, was really appreciated. No more so than your use of the vernacular in the piece. Was there a particular desire to want to represent the show and the gnaws and so on and so forth, and meaner than the mugs? Were these phrases from your childhood that had particular value, or your life that had particular value that you wanted to see on the printed page?
Definitely. Kind of connected to the previous story that I was talking about as far as passing the reading requirement. When I was in second grade, I did Hooked on Phonics, specifically because I think in about second grade I moved over to a private school, and then there were some concerns about my diction, so I had to take this Hooked on Phonics, which, I mean, I have mixed feelings about it. I think I learned a lot from it as far as like sentences and syntax and like sounds and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of good technical things that you could get out of it, but the reasoning behind it is, it's pretty dark as far as having to change your diction level in order to fit into this new environment. So that's something that I had to investigate too. And it's kind of funny because, I mean, the conversation that I'm having with you all, this is how I talk to us in a comfortable setting. And that's just, it's kind of interesting the way the perceptions of who you are, and just even things just to like your intelligence level or what you're capable of, can be framed by the way that you speak to people in different settings. And so I wanted to represent more so of just the rhythms that I grew up with, and also the sense that there are many different syntaxes and many different diction levels to the English language, and they don't have any bearing on who you are as a person specifically. And then that's also something that I wanted the reader to think about. If you were to read the story collection and you make a certain connection to Avery, you would have to accept his perspectives and his outlooks, and you'd have to also respect where he's coming from across the board as far as everything as his character goes. So I did consciously, and especially since like when I sit down and write, I really do like sentence structure and syntax, and I think that the home language I grew up with is something I very much respect. I think it's very beautiful. It just has its own unique sensibility. So that was something like, before I started writing this collection, I was writing other stories that I worked with different kinds of voices. And then there's also kind of like, if you're writing a creative story and you're trying to think of like just what's just like what's a standard line or this or that, it didn't feel like as natural to me. It didn't feel as comfortable. So I understood that I needed to figure out how to represent what is comfortable and natural to me in the best way possible.
Well, I sure did appreciate it. I think you were posing a question about the tactile nature of the novel.
I was. We were talking about the how you can hear the sounds, how you can smell the smells. You have a portion, Tarrell and I were talking earlier about how you can smell what crack smells like when it's cooking. As far as we explore at literary discussions all of the anywhere the word works, right? And where what I did notice is that there's not a lot of music, but in the beginning you do choose 2 music quotes to open the book, and I wanted to talk to you about those because I love Danny Brown. I do. I love Danny Brown. I became familiar with him with Black Milk. So why did you choose this Kendrick Lamar and this Danny Brown quote?
So I'd say specifically with the quotes, that was a lot of the music I was listening to while I was drafting the book itself. And also, there's kind of an interesting thing in graduate school as far as you're reading a lot of really great writers. You're reading Raymond Carver, Elizabeth Strout, Alice Munro. Of course, as you figure out specifically what you want to focus on, you start to pursue reading the writers to speak to you more specifically. But one thing I found is that the genre that most communicated to me and reflected the stories I wanted to tell was in hip hop, and specifically with artists like Kendrick Lamar and Danny Brown, and covering that kind of that gauntlet of the sense of having a certain blend of combining sentimentality with cynicism, with also a pursuit of truth, because you can't really get to the heart of a story if you're not trying to look at it from all the different angles, trying to look at it objectively in a sense from like, how does it impact you personally? What are some other considerations as far as the community or society you're interacting with? How might this resolve itself? So with the Danny Brown quote, that's probably one of my favorite songs off of the album XXX. And specifically, what's interesting about Danny Brown is that he has, and just like a lot of really good MCs, he has different personas that he might adopt when he's telling a story. And he also, like, what I really like about XXX and some of his earlier work is that you can tell when he's incredibly expressive, and you can tell when he's talking about something that's really emotional or personal, because even when he has his one persona where it's a little bit more focused on sort of like shock value and spectacle and telling a joke, when he talks about something serious, there's a specific way his voice cracks, or his voice might change as he's trying to get into this difficult, like this emotionally difficult terrain. And so with that song quote in particular, that reflected a big part of the narrative that I was pursuing, and then also just the way that he's emotionally vulnerable, where a lot of the bravado that he has drops, and he's trying to talk about a serious subject matter that connected to me. And then with the Kendrick Lamar quote, that's one of my favorite songs off of A Good Kid, Mad City. And I was thinking, with the collection that I was working on, so I was going through graduate school, and when I went through graduate school, I did my classes. I had an RA position. I had a position in the writing center, and then I had 2 jobs. So the whole time, some folks, they go to graduate school and they can just focus on graduate school itself.
Who are those people?
Yeah.
Those people.
Right.
So I had to worry about paying my rent, which it wasn't really a worry. I enjoyed being in that space, and I've always been, I'm not necessarily a workaholic, but once I'm interested in something, or if I have a particular goal, I'm perfectly happy to, I might work myself a bit too much to reach that goal. So when I was getting to graduate school and I was working really hard on this thesis, and then also in the following years where, I'd routinely, I might have my day job that's, 40 or 50 or more hours of work. But I'd get up, work, and then come back home, and then I would write. So that's another element of working. Sometimes I would get up at 6, work till 5 or so, get back home, and then start writing again. Start writing at like maybe 9 or 10. Stay up maybe a bit too late, and then get back up and do it all over again. And so whenever I got to the point where the book was coming together and some things were going in the right direction, that was one question that I had to pose to myself. Am I worth it? Did I put enough work in?
You said some interesting things there. I want to touch on. The first is I'm glad, because when reading the book, I thought I recognized what could be described as a hip hop aesthetic there. So I'm glad that my literary chops are somewhat acute to what's going on. But you talked about some of the reading that you did in graduate school. And I could not help but notice that not a lot of the authors that you named were from what we would consider the tradition, the African American tradition. Now, I should say traditions, because there are a multiplicity of African American literary traditions out there. But with that being said, reading the back of your cover, I see that Tom Williams compares Avery to Holden Caulfield and Esperanza, and to a certain degree Flavor Flav. I guess the point that I'm getting to is that, to what degree do you consider yourself a novelist within the tradition, and to what degree do you consider yourself a novelist without the tradition? Am I making sense to you? Because I see you signifying on a number of literary approaches and what could be considered a number of literary traditions, from Renaissance artists to the Lost Generation to some of our more contemporary writers like Percival Everett. But can you talk to me about how you see yourself within the terrain of the literary landscape?
I would say, and it's kind of difficult because I think particularly I use any literary tradition as a framework to figure out exactly what set of techniques that I should be pursuing to produce what kind of results. But mainly they're within service to me pursuing a particular truth. So I try to frame like what's the reality that I'm trying to create, or the truth I'm trying to pursue, and then I might draw from any number of influences. Okay. And those influences, they vary depending upon what part of the project I'm looking at. So on the sentence level, I believe that like a good story, it has to start from the sentence level and start from the syntax and the sense and the meaning that you're giving there. I found myself relying on a lot of hip hop and contemporary poets, and then also kind of as a balancing act, I would look at maybe more sparse contemporary writers, okay, who like even kind of like minimalist writers who like I don't necessarily like minimalism, as in it's not my chicken soup for the soul, but it's instructive as far as how to like make sure that your sentences are maintaining a certain amount of sharpness. Okay. But I would also want to blend that with just like what's natural as far as storytelling. So when I would think about like, so it's kind of, and it's sort of convoluted, and I don't know if part of it's just me tricking myself into thinking a certain way, but I was trying to take some of the sharpness of certain minimalists, and then combine it with sort of the boldness of hip hop and contemporary poetry, and then also use that as a way to convey the storytelling that I grew up with. Okay. Because I heard a lot of really great stories at my grandmother's kitchen. You hear a lot of really great stories on the corner. Sometimes you're walking down the street, somebody interrupts you to tell you a story about this or that. And so I was trying to figure out the best way that I could frame that and make it impactful. As far as the wider scope of the project, in the sense of, so I would define Avery Cult as a short story collection that relies on realism with a little bit of postmodernism and the city Gothic tradition. So from there, I'm drawing from a lot of short story writers. I'm looking at ZZ Packard, Elizabeth Strout, Jasmine Ward.
Jasmine Ward. We'll talk about that in a second.
And so I'm trying to figure out. So like, as far as like essential truth, is that I think that there's a lot of power in looking at, say, a difficult situation, and trying to pull the good out of it, or seeing something that other folks would pass over or be frightened of, and trying to pull some of the beauty out of it. So that's something that is specifically falls within the Gothic tradition. And you know, also if you grow up in an environment where there's some downturn and decay, you're, you know, naturally, like if you see an abandoned building but there's like there's a honeysuckle bush, or you know there's some morning glories, you have to take that whole picture. You know, I don't see just the abandoned building, I see the flowers that are surrounding it, or I see what the building was, like the architecture itself. And so that was something interesting to visualize and figure out how to put that on the page. And then from there, then that's when I applied it to the tradition I was working within. So that's a whole convoluted way to say that generally I put something on the page and I work it line by line, and then as it starts to build momentum, then I start to see like, where might this fit in as far as a tradition, or communicating with other authors. And then from there I start to refine my techniques. And I do kind of like, you know, if I take like if I say like, okay, I'm trying, and I always say I attempt things, I'll never say that I was really successful. So like you know, I'll say like, okay, I'm attempting realism, but if there's a point at which I can throw in something else that feels right, I might snatch something there. So like in Cauldron, there's a part where Avery touches some crack cocaine and then his arm falls off and it comes back on. So I knew essentially I could get away with that because it felt right. It communicates that feeling of like the weight of touching something like that. But then it, you know, I also have a first person narrator that you don't know if you completely trust them. And it's also a surreal situation in and of itself. So that's like, I can make his arm fall back. You know, people might go along with me here. And I guess with all that being said, as far as working within a tradition and then having conversations with other folks, that's something that I always approach with a lot of respect and meaning. And that, to me, when you're sitting down to write, and especially when you're pursuing publication, you're doing the best you can at the time that you're writing it. So of course you can always grow, you can always you can always consider other elements of the conversation, but at the same time I want to make sure that I'm adding something that's progressive and productive, that if somebody I respect and admire reads anything that I write or that's published, I want them to be able to, like in the same way that if the same way that I could read Song of Solomon or read Black Boy and feel like the authors of those books are doing something for me, I want to be able to give back to those authors and everybody else to say that I'm doing my best to carry on this conversation that was started here.
Okay, so speaking of that, I noticed that you opened the book with the killing of a rodent, right? Like in Native Son. Mm-hmm. And we talked about how it has a three-part is a three chapter or three-part book. What type, you said you draw from certain influences, like who do you draw from, or what types of what parts of their influence do you draw from?
So I'd say specifically with Richard Wright, so that was a big turning point in my decision to pursue writing, because I always liked writing, I always liked reading, but I hadn't read a lot of stuff that had folks that respected my, that expressed my experience. So whenever I read Black Boy when I was in high school, and it was actually for a philosophy class, because all the English courses were reading a lot of Shakespeare. which Shakespeare is great, but you know, 4 years of Shakespeare, you could only get so you could only get so far. So when I read Black Boy, I was about 15 or 16, and I didn't understand the book, and then it impacted me emotionally, and so I was kind of confused as to like, you know, this is something that I can't really grasp, but it's speaking directly to me and it's mirroring some element of my reality. So there has to be something to this. And it was funny because I asked the instructor about it, and she gave me, you know, kind of like one of those vague instructor answers that you do. And she was just like, well, you know, there are patterns in the book, so if you keep reading it, you'll see more patterns. Which that frustrated me to no end, but it also set up the framework of that there's no easy way to explore something that's complex. So that started me on the path of like, if this author did something for me in the sense of that they created this artifact that I could relate to, something that I could find a way to find some kind of hope as far as seeing a representation of a life similar to mine in this, you know, in the stage as far as it being a published book, you know, that gave me a lot of drive to move forward. So I think that as far as the influences I get, a lot of it's kind of organic in the sense that I try to look at different angles of framing experiences or realities that aren't always in the mainstream, or that could be communicated to the mainstream a little bit differently. But also on the other hand, I just want to communicate those experiences, and I just want to see who it will connect to.
Well, speaking of influences, and I want to talk about some that I see in the novel, and I want to get your thoughts on that. But you mentioned one, and I can't help but name drop here. You mentioned Jasmine Ward, right? Jasmine Ward and I happen to have been classmates at Stanford once upon a time before she became this big literary giant. So I love following her work, and Salvage the Bones is one of my favorite novels of all times, right? So when you suggested that she was a sort of an influence on your approach, I will tell you where I saw her influence in the novel, and you tell me. Now, I classify in many regards Salvage the Bones as disaster literature because there's that hurricane going on there. So I saw her resonating most when there was the crack being sold in the big storm outside. I literally wrote in my book, Salvage the Bones, when I came across that section right there, because it seemed to resonate so much with me for how she painted the scenes and what they were doing in the midst of a hurricane in Salvage the Bones. But am I anywhere near on point there, or am I way off track?
Oh no, you're on point. Her influences, and on the one side where I like to read certain authors that work very minimally and with like very simple sentences, I also like to read authors that are really audacious, and then that kind of like that builds my confidence to be just as audacious. And her prose style is incredible. The way that, and that also relates to that sense of the novel being tactile, like having that level of detail to generate an experience. So, and it's the level of work that she puts into each paragraph, because she manages that that really particular feat of being both very concise and precise, but also very abundant. And so that's something that I admire, and that's something I'm always trying to chase, in that sense of like, what's the clearest way that I can communicate something that's really rich. And then also with that disaster literature, in the sense of, I'm concerned with not so much like something happening in the moment. I'm always concerned about the after effects. And so particularly to relate this back to North St. Louis, one thing that I found is that when I talk to older residents of the community and they talk about what the community or what the neighborhood was at one point, which you can see the big old houses, you can see even some blocks have gates and things like that. There's a lot of really great just buildings with great architecture. You can see what was, but I know the sadness for me is that when folks describe it to me, I can picture it, but I can't quite grasp it because I can't put that into the framework of the reality that I grew up in.
Gotcha.
And so I'm trying to consider those after effects and like it all relates back to a shared sense of struggle and also survival, as in, you know, how do you come full circle? What are some of those lessons or what are some of those tenets that folks relied on to get them at a certain place to where they're building the community, and how do you continue that tradition? How do you hold some of those tools for survival close to you? How do you keep respecting that and moving forward through the after effects of some economic disaster?
Just one follow-up before I let Nick get in here. I also wanted to ask you about the, how do we describe it, the book within the book, Teeth's story. I also, that was one of the other hallmarks of the book that I thought landed you squarely within the tradition. We often see the pattern of the book within the book. Most recently, what comes to mind is Everett's Erasure. Percival Everett's Erasure, where he has my pathology in the middle of the book, right? Similarly akin to your organization here in Avery Coat. I mean, also, both of you have a 3-part organization like Native Son, Warner Rights work. But I wanted to know that did Everett have any influence on your organization or approach or characterization? Because one more thing here, because I noticed that the description of teeth in certain points sort of resonates with the male protagonist in my pathology. The use of some of the language around teeth, right? Particularly, I'm thinking about the instance, I think it's around teeth, where they go, fuck, you old bitch ass nigga, right? I thought that signified off of Everett's Wounded. Everett has this character in Wounded named Gus, who's about to kill this other guy, and before he does it, he goes, fuck, right? So I was just seeing these little kernels, and I was wondering if they were conscious in your mind, or they just happen to be coincidental.
I haven't read a lot of Percival Everett. I've read a few short stories here and there. As far as the characters and then the language, that's all coming from the environment that I grew up in and trying to figure out the best way to reflect that. Okay. And then, like, when that comes to, say, like the technique and tea story, I really wanted to have a frame story somewhere in the collection, and it was really important because whenever I originally conceived the story collection itself, there were going to be different characters who it would either be a first person or a third person narration where it follows them. And then when I decided to stick with Avery's voice, I understood that I limited my range a little bit. So I was trying to figure out who would get to tell a story and at what point they would tell a story. And it was kind of a strange decision because each of the characters, from Cheryl to Yell to the Granddad, like they all at one point they had a moment where they were going to tell a first person story or have their own story branch. But then as I was moving towards the end of the collection and as I was more understanding exactly what the collection wanted to be and what it needed to be, I decided that Teeth needed to have the moment where he comes out with the story, especially in the sense of, so the collection with the way that it's structured with the 3 parts is that the first set of stories, Avery doesn't have any agency at all. He's just watching and he's trying to figure things out. And one of the big threads in the story collection is a lot of stuff that's going on is completely over Avery's head. Mm-hmm. He's very clueless, and even moments when he's trying to do the right thing is very arguable, where you're just like...
We picked up on that. I'm sorry to interject there, but like being and Nick and I'm trying to get us to recognize that we're kind of cut from a different cloth. But at any rate, being kind of children of this environment, we thought that Avery was kind of oblivious to a lot of what was going on around him. And was that intentional on your part to characterize him as such, or were you trying to get us to recognize that there are like human beings that exist like this in these parts of the world?
A little bit of both, and part of it is so basically Avery spends a lot of time in his house, and that's the sense. The points in which we have the short stories where they start out, they're points at which he can't keep to himself essentially, and a lot of the incidents that he runs into, they're not things that he causes. It's just a sense of like he got out of the house, he walked around the corner, and the strange thing happened. So there's a sense that like as far as and I had thought about going a little bit deeper into it, but you know, essentially he just stays in the house, tries to like take care of his stuff. He reads his comic books. There's kind of like a disconnect between what folks are trying to tell him and what he absorbs. And then also he finds himself in situations in which he feels like he can't really ask for help. So he's kind of like fumbling with a lot of stuff. And there's a sense as far as like whenever a community goes through some difficulty, there can be on one side, there can be a sense of the community rallying and coming together. But then on the other side, there can be a sense of there being greater isolation. And so with Avery's family, and then also with the grandparents and their business, there's a sense that they're isolating themselves, and that they're even pulling away from certain concerns in the community. So essentially, I mean, I think, you know, that's pretty realistic. As a person who can be fairly oblivious and find endless resources of being surprised, I think that, and you know, that's also a survival strategy, because if you live in a place where there's a certain amount of danger or you can fall into some bad circumstances, I think that also goes along with family systems where it's just like, you know, hey, don't go down to the side of the block, don't go out at this time, you got to come home at this time, going around the corner, come right back. You know, even when I would ride my bike, I remember one summer I would ride my bike all over the place, and I wasn't actually allowed to do that. I would do a lot of exploration, but my folks were always worried that I'd find myself in a strange situation. So he kind of, there's kind of like a sense of that there are a lot of like just real life situations and even kind of like, let's say, adult situations that Avery is being consciously sheltered from, and he's also doing some of the sheltering himself. And then in the first part of the story collection, it's more so he's just watching, he doesn't have a lot of agency. The second part of the story collection, he has a little bit more sensibility and a bit more agency, but he's still avoiding things. And then the third part of the collection is him moving towards situations that he can't ignore, and he has to be a part of finding the solution or trying to figure out the way forward. And I think it's realistic that in day-to-day life, stability is really difficult to acquire and maintain. You know, it can be an effort of a lifetime to get to a comfortable place and to have some of that regularity or normalcy. So where the collection ends off, you get a sense of like Avery has a little bit more awareness, and he's able to get to the point to where he's maybe facing some difficult emotions head on, but he's still, he might be on the path to where he could start to figure it out, but you really don't know where he might end up or what is right or wrong for him.
Oh, I know where that's going to end up for Avery at the end. That's going to end up like that meal he tried to cook, right? like that's another example where he tried to face something head on. He knew something had to be done, right? So I applaud him for that. But his follow through was horrible, right? Right. I'm sorry, Nick. You look like you were trying to get in there for a second.
I wasn't. It didn't. You were jiving with the current flow. I was going to turn directions.
Well, help me turn this boat.
I wanted to talk about your treatment of the women in the book. specifically with the way that they talk to Avery, right? There's lots of verbal abuse. There is a lot of talking about him when they don't think that he's listening, or maybe even sometimes when they know that he is. Like, I'm thinking about the funeral scene with the women around the table, the way that the grandmother speaks to him. And it almost seems like they, I don't want to say beat the will out of him, but I think that's what break his spirit, or break, when you say that the way that the grandmother spoke to Avery, hit like leeches in his brain or something like that. Like, he was very affected by the way that the women spoke and treated him. Can you speak to the treatment of the women in the book?
Well, that kind of goes back to that sense of how do you express love and care and concern, in the sense of you're trying to teach someone how to survive something. Mm-hmm. And so, like, even something like the concept of verbal abuse or mental abuse, this also, like, comes up against the idea of what it is to be masculine, mm-hmm. What it means to be tough, to be somebody that can do what needs to be done, someone who can survive.
Yeah, they reinforce the patriarchy a lot. Mm-hmm.
And so there's kind of, almost that sense of just like, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. So, words have a lot of force, they have a lot of power. And so essentially what the women in the story collection, they're attempting to do, they're trying to communicate some things that are important to survival to Avery, and they're trying to shape and mold him. And ultimately the strategies that they're using, they might be maladaptive. And it's questionable the effect that they're having, but it's also ways in which they're communicating to each other, and so, like, there's kind of a difference between, like, one of the contrasts between Avery and Yell is that you could consider that Yell, being older, she's a little bit more with it, she's a little bit more successful, at least early on, as far as, like, being able to apply, like, okay, like in the second story, when Avery's having trouble with school, Avery, Danielle, she's more capable. She's more aware, both because she's older, but also just because she might be listening more. Whenever there's a point at which there's some deterioration in the family unit, she begins to act out more, because she's just more aware, and she's also more aware of that she's not liking the treatment, she can't get along with it. But with that being said, it's not that the women are necessarily, their intention is not to break someone's will or to even really be harmful. It's really in that effort of just like, we're gonna toughen this person up. We're going to point to what we believe that you need to be to survive this environment. And then that creates a contrast between the external, as far as the messaging that they're giving him, and then what's internally happening with Avery. So in the story with the funeral scene, that's him really questioning, like, him. It's almost like he's not like lashing out in the sense of like, I'm angry, this hurts my feelings. It's more so like he's saying, like, I'm really trying to be this, but I don't know how to be this, and I'm trying to take the examples and then also take the communication, and it's like, how, like, what does this add up to? And I think the next part of it that Avery's not getting at, or that he's not mature enough to pursue, is whether or not it's right for him. And then he doesn't have the global understanding to see that, what the intent is behind the way that he's being communicated to.
I just want to ask this question, because you keep referring to the book as a collection of short stories, which I want to get into some genre definitions here in a second, but I can't help but notice that it is the Nielsen Prize. It is the winner for the Nielsen Prize for a first novel. So help me understand how you reconcile this in your mind. Your literature here is award-winning, particularly for a category of a novel, yet every time you refer to it as a collection of stories. Help me thread that needle there.
Oh, so that kind of goes back to what I attempt to do, and then also because sometimes with literary definitions, they kind of come down to like what you intended, and then also what other people interpret it as. So for the nuts and bolts, the Nielsen Prize, that's for first novel, novella, or linked collection of stories.
Okay.
So I really love short stories because
What's your definition of a short story?
It's so for the nuts and bolts definition, a short story starts at about 2,000. It's between the range of 2,000 to 8,000 words.
Okay.
I think you can do a lot with a short story depending upon which techniques that you apply.
Hold on, my friend, because we got an ongoing bet over here. I got to help us. Okay, so your definition.
No, let him finish.
Hold on. I want to make sure he answers the question now. Now, it seemed as though length had a great deal because he named words. He named word lengths, Nick. So I'm just trying to highlight the answer that he gave.
Techniques.
I'm going to let him finish. It seemed as though length was a premier impetus for you determining whether or not something was a short story because you gave us those numbers, right? So just so we're all clear here, we would like for you, from a professional author's point of view, a published author's point of view, for our audience and for Nick and I's sake of being friends, could you give us what your thoughts are on a short story, what differentiates it from a novel, what differentiates a novel from a novella?
Okay. A lot of it comes down to the particular, because there are particular types in a format sense. There are particular types of stories, novellas, and novels. So one way that I can see it is it's a matter of time and space. So with a short story, at least in the style that I like to pursue them, it's a matter of compression, and you know that you have a limited amount of space in order to produce a reaction. So I like to spend my time focusing on tension. And the range that I tend to favor is maybe about 16 to 20 pages for a short story. You can get a lot of interesting effects within that page range, especially if you pay attention to your syntax and your sentence structure. So a good example would be T's Story. So there are novels that you could spend a lot of time developing the different characters and different voices, and then you have a frame, and then you go off from the frame, and so on and so forth. I challenge myself to see if I can produce the same results in a shorter space. And then
so for you, a short story can have many of the components of a novella, just in a more compressed. I mean, the short story can have many of the components of a novel, just in a more compressed space.
Yes. And well, like one of the big benefits of having a novel, if you have a 300 to 500 page novel, is that you have the possibility of having a stronger cumulative effect. And that if you stick with the character in a setting for 500 pages, at some point you're going to feel something. No matter what it is, you're going to feel something by the time that it's over. Another good rule of thumb is how really, I mean, I hate to put it this way, but it's how much room you have to hide. If you have 16 pages, all the 16 pages have to work. Yeah. If you have 7 pages, all 7 pages have to work. It all has to fit together and be not just very polished, it just has to be sensible in sort of like the story logic it creates. Whereas if you write a novel, you just have more pages where, you could have some soggy pages in the middle and it won't really affect things so much. You can do just more general world building. You could do more, you could step into a room and you could spend 20 or 30 pages just describing this room just to do it. And that's fair and valid. So that's where kind of that sense of concision comes in.
What about with the novella then? How do we help our audience understand then what helps constitute a novella?
So a novella, word count, I'm trying to think. I can't remember the specific word count, but I think like a novella essentially, it's where you get to maybe an extended or more in-depth character study. So like different types of so like the character study. The character study, you could have a short story that's a character study, a novella that's a character study, a novel that's a character study. But they all have to work in different ways. So if you have Salvage the Bones could be considered a character study. And then like as far as like let me think of like what's a contemporary short story that's a character study. Maybe like Little Bursts by Elizabeth Strout. That's a character study, and that we get the sense of one. So like in a short story, let's say in Little Bursts, the plot of Little Bursts is that you have your main character who's an older woman, and she's struggling through life, and she's jealous of her son and his new wife. So during a party, she marks up one of the her daughter-in-law's dresses, and she basically explains to you why she behaves that way. And so there, in this character study, you're focusing on one particular thing that she does, one particular part of her character, and also telling this difficult thing, but also getting a sense of sympathy, and even getting the reader to relate, as in, she does these petty little things sometimes, and then sometimes, you got to read that story and think like, well, maybe everybody does that. I might do that myself.
Petty be going around these days.
And so when you take that character study and apply it to Salvage the Bones, with Salvage the Bones, you can follow the narrator through across a lot of different situations and get a lot of different senses of her personality. But still, there's still a main thread, and there's still a main concept there's still a main element of this character you're trying to figure out. And then I would say that maybe with a novella, the main thing is that you just have more room to explore. So we're in a short story that's a character study. You can only, and it's debatable. You could explore 2 or 3 aspects, but let's just say generally it's safest to explore 1, or that's the most usual. In a novella, you might be able to get away with definitely exploring those 2 or 3 aspects. Also, the ways in which you have characters, like that's another technical. I feel like
so you don't have no right answer. Huh? So you don't even have an answer as concise as mine. Okay, my answer is hella concise. Nicole's is all over the place, so I vote for my answer. Right? I suggest and I teach students that a novella is longer than a short story, but shorter than a novel. Mm-hmm. That's it.
No.
Now, if you want to I can get into the weeds I'm with you with, it is customary that in a short story we want to follow one thread of perhaps a character's perspective or something along those lines. My thing is the level of development that can take place along any of the formal aspects of the novel. They're going to be limited in a novella, and they're going to be even more limited in a short story. Now, we can debate on what is limited, but I think we're talking through the same mouth out of different sides, Miss Nick.
I don't even get to say my side.
What's your side, my friend?
So, for me, a novella, yes, it explores, like you said, maybe 1 or 2 characters, but the time you have, not that you have a lot of space, but in the actual story, the time in the story is compressed or expanded, limited time for you to create tension, and they usually explore like maybe one theme. I'm thinking like Nella Larsen's Passing, right?
Okay.
So you have those 2 characters.
Okay.
They're talking about passing, and there's not enough. They have to compress the time enough, but expand the story so that you can fit the story within the front before she pushes her.
So you consider Passing a novella?
I do.
Okay. What do you think, Ron? Because you read Passing before? Mm-mm. Okay. Well, you need to read it so we can debate it.
Benito Cereno.
Honestly, I haven't read a lot of novellas.
Goodbye Columbus.
Awakening.
Awakening is a novel.
Awakening is a novella.
Kate Chopin.
It's a novella.
No,
See, we can have this is different. This is an argument for a different day. Let us get back to Avery Cope. Nick, bring us back on point here. We told you it was lit with the discussions here, okay?
No, sir.
If it was a little later in the day, we'd let y'all know we were lit on, but we still drinking Starbucks
Yes,
here right
we
now.
are.
All right? Nick, can you bring us back to focus on discussion on this collection of short stories, aka a novel here, please?
Let me see. I didn't consider the fact that that the agency was a determining factor in the differentiating the three parts.
Mm-hmm.
Because for the most part, I kind of felt like he just let life happen to him. You know, like there were a lot of points where, until the third part, where he was like, I wanted to just jab him in the eye through his skull, but I just dropped it and kept going. Or, you know, he wants to do, but he does not do. You know, he wants to act and he does not. So I didn't even consider it I didn't even consider I considered it apathy when I was reading it.
Mm-hmm.
But now that you say it's that he didn't have the agency to do different things, it makes it, it's a different
approach to the
it's a different interpretation now, right?
I don't think he's such a little bitch ass dude no more. Now that you told us some of your, and this is where authorial intent. You know, people say you're not supposed to be concerned about authorial intent, but this is one case where it allows me to give a little bit more space for the character.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was trying to argue for that earlier when Nick and I were discussing. I was like, but there's so many horde characters that have been represented. I mean, Bigger, we're all trying to run away from Bigger in a certain extent, right? But I have to admit, I was still rather critical because I was like, this dude just a little, everything yelled and called him in this book, right? I'm sorry, Nick, I just keep stepping on you.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Why is he so apathetic? I think that's the word I want.
Well, I think I guess like maybe the best story to look to as far as the framework and the sense of the turning point, or kind of to speak to the understanding of that, is nothing uglier than gold on a corpse. In the sense of considering where he's at, this is another example of like, in this situation, here's just what you would do.
Right.
But he stops to question it. So the story cycle itself, it very much is focused on his interior. And especially if you compare the external action to what he's actually thinking about it, you could consider that every time that there's, to put it concisely, he's just mildly neurotic about things. So if you say like, hey, you just do this, he's going to stop and he's going to think about it.
Yeah.
And so if you're in an environment that favors action over thought, at every turn, he's going to think about it and think about a few different paths before he actually comes to a decision. And so that's a combination of the way he's viewing the world, and then also just some of him parsing some of the morality or the ethics of doing certain things, and then also where that places him within the community itself. So he kind of bumps up against because in general you get the sense that, or you could interpret or see the sense that Avery doesn't really want to hurt anybody. He wants to live within a certain amount of peace. He wants to give everybody their space. So then he finds himself in situations where he has to act, where somebody might get harmed, and he considers like, well, if I do this, what will happen to this person? What will happen to me? So essentially, that's what it comes down to. And then there's also the sense of, is that something that, is that a good quality essentially, to stop and think before you act, to consider the way your actions can have consequences on other people, and even consider the way that other people treat each other. So that's one of the main concerns. And so it's not apathy. It's not in the sense that he doesn't care, because as far as the intent, if he didn't care, he would have robbed the unconscious person, he would have done this, he would have done that. But it's more that he's like, something doesn't feel right to him, so that keeps him second guessing things. And then also considering you can become desensitized to violence. You can become desensitized to even just like ethical dilemmas, you know, as far as like, you know, things that happen to people that you can't really help. But at the same time, you only become desensitized because you become shocked at first, and then over time you become apathetic. So you could consider that a lot of the moments in which we're following Avery in these story settings, it's, you know, maybe seeing violence on a regular basis is something that he is used to and he doesn't think about. He ignores it. But then it comes to these moments where he can't ignore this, and then that opens him up to some investigation. So it's so that was the intent overall. It wasn't, you know. And the other thing I wanted to be very careful of too is that I know, so Avery's the protagonist, so if you pick up the book and you read the book, you're going to favor Avery, and you're going to favor his viewpoint. The only problem is that doesn't leave room for the rest of the community. And so one thing I was conscious of is that I didn't want anybody to come off, I wanted people to come off honest in their actions and in the way they interact with others. But I didn't want anybody to come off as a villain per se or a bad guy because of the way they interact with Avery. And I also didn't want Avery to be like a hero or like special in any kind of way. Well, one way to look at it is at some point during the drafting of the book, I considered Avery being an artist so that he'd actually be a comic book artist. And that would have been cool as far as like opening up some possibilities for stories and like doing a little bit more postmodernism and so on and so on and so forth. There's also a track where maybe he like got into singing or something like that. But I intentionally said like, well, you know, people might latch on to this talent he has and say like, if he pursues this talent or if he's like gifted or this or that, then that's his way to move forward.
And I think that would have kind of ruined his regularness, right? I mean, like, one of the things that I kind of like about Avery is that he, I mean, other than being the unique person that he is definitely unique, but he's such a regular little boy, right? I think one of the things I want to push back against, that you just said is that you didn't want to make Avery the hero juxtaposed against the other people in the I think that inevitably kind of happens though, because for me, Avery is like a hero of humanity, right? And what I mean by that is, I always, when I see representations of black males in novels, I inevitably go to Bigger Thomas. Because Bigger Thomas is such the repository of the epitome of black bruteness, right? That we spend a lot of our time consciously or unconsciously trying to develop other types to represent in the novel, right? And for me, Avery kinda is a contemporary approach and try at that, and it's solidified even more when I juxtapose him against the other characters in the novel. Like, for example, even though Teeth himself is going through this journey, right? He's going through this journey where he used to be a crack dealer, and to this point to where he doesn't even want to sell crack, he throws it into the lake. But Avery's interaction with him, in addition to highlighting his wisdom and so on and so forth, highlights his still shortcomings, right? His interactions with Dee highlights still his shortcomings, right? I came into this discussion wanting to champion Granddad because I thought of all of the representations of the males there, although there is some generational distance between Granddad and my generation. I thought that Granddad was one of the more positive representations of black masculinity until you hit me with this thought about the area of intimacy, right? And I thought that Dad was one of the worst representations of masculinity until you hit me with this intimacy thing. And I'm like, you know, one of the things that is devoid in Bigger's life is any type of intimacy with another black male. All right. So I had to give you room for how you creatively, you know, presented that. But back to my original point, Avery in his obliviousness, in his just humanness, in his, pure humanity, seems to expose a lot of the shortcomings and the other characters that he interacts with, right? And so to get back to your point, in a certain degree, I think that like he kind of serves as a foil against the community, right? Because he is literally almost this embodiment of this innocent kid coming of age, getting bits of wisdom from these people who themselves haven't quite figured it out, but they want to hold him accountable for living up to a certain understanding, and like he's just trying to figure it out, right? So it kind of, I just wanted to say that it kind of, in that sense, it kind of makes a lot of the people in the short stories kind of like bad guys, to the extent that they're not really affording Avery that space to kind of figure it out for himself. I mean, he's a punk ass bitch. He's a whoop his ass, put it on him right now, right? He's a make him a man. Like he's not in an area where he's devoid of that. And I'm not saying he should be, but it seems that we're kind of asking for another way to rear our children, possibly, right? That's what it kind of calls out to me.
Well, another way to look at it is the concept of excellence versus being average. So like, let's say that in a functioning society that people can be average and be comfortable, that you get up, you work 8 hours a day, you have time for other activities, you go to sleep, you should be able to save and take care, you should have savings for a health emergency, so on and so forth. You should be able to be average and live a healthy, productive life. But within contemporary America and with capitalism, you have to be excellent. And if you're an African American person, you have to be 2 or 3 times as excellent. So the consideration would be too that a lot of the external characters that he works with, they're just really stressed out because they're either working incredibly hard to stay afloat, or they've done some things and they've done some really difficult things to try to get to the next level or to try to provide themselves some security, and it completely just, destroyed a part of them. So each of the characters you can kind of see from the way that the grandparents work to the jobs that Cheryl holds down until she can't hold down the jobs anymore, to
talk about that lipstick.
to the father, the way that he gambles. He's constantly gambling. So a lot of it's just kind of tied to just that sense of, and if you make money gambling, you have to be a good gambler. Right. And if you make money dealing drugs, you have to be a good drug dealer if you're able to survive over time. So part of what and even his sister, as far as she's excelling in school and she's trying to figure that out, and even towards the end of the collection, she's trying to figure out, how she's going to work to support the family. Each of the characters in their own way, they're understanding that the world isn't going to give them any breaks or give them that space. So in that way, they're trying to push forward, and in that sense, they also might do some damage in the way that they interact with each other. And so in a sense, as far as like the way that Avery pursues things, he might be mistaken in the sense that he doesn't have to, or he might not feel like he's getting the message that he has to rise to the call of action, that he has to go above and beyond.
He's going to have to make a choice at some point, right? Like all of those people who I may be mistaking as exposing their shortcomings, what I'm calling their shortcomings might actually be a reflection of them having to have made a choice at some point and it not working out for them as they had planned. Avery is kind of dancing around having to make that choice, and perhaps as we near the end of the collection, he's finally arriving to a point where he has to start making some decisions. Nick?
You wanted to talk about the lipstick.
Oh, I just wanted to ask, man. Okay, so in that scene where Dad is, I think it's after Dad has found the money in the couch, right? He's come and torn the house apart searching for money, and he finds the money in the couch, and so now Mom has to pick up extra shifts at the job. Why does she put on the lipstick?
Oh, to try to to look more professional in a sense, because there are a couple of moments where so Avery persists in being kind of like a gross, grubby kid throughout the collection, and one part of entering just entering a professional setting or a more mainstream space is being concerned about your presentation. That if you don't look nice and attractive, that people will judge you and think that you're less. So there's a line where it talks about the family and their designer clothes as an attempt to, and then with the mother and
when they were searching for him when he was missing, was that when they were talking about them looking like whatever they were looking like in their designer clothes? Is that when it took place? Okay.
Yeah, because there's like a little bit of focus on like the mother's earrings, and then they look beat down and tired in their designer clothes.
Yeah, right.
So then there's a sense that like generationally, you have the grandparents. They were able to do a lot of good work in building up a business, and so they were trying to set up the next generation for success. And then, due to some societal circumstances,
that shit hit.
Mm-hmm. And then you have Cheryl and Robert. They're trying to. They weren't successful in taking the next step, and then they couldn't take the next step, and then you have their children. And so part of when you look at Cheryl and Robert, it's a sense of what strategies are they trying to use to survive and adapt and move to progress. Because there's a point when I was generating the story collection where I was thinking of like, well, what if Cheryl inherited the store? Because you have the grandparents, and they're working very hard at this business, and it's something that I didn't find that, considering the way that the collection was coming together, that there would have been space for it. But there, at one point I was thinking of there could have been a debate between Cheryl and the grandmother about taking over the store. But ultimately there's a sense of that there's a miscommunication to where, instead of Cheryl working however many jobs and doing this and Robert doing that, they could have been being groomed to take the store over, but they chose not to. So you kind of have that disconnect in what was going to build wealth or prosperity for the family, but also they can't control what's happening in the neighborhood itself. So they're looking, Cheryl and the father, they're looking for a way, just a way to get out. They figure they need a different geography, and so they're adapting to that, but they're not successful in doing so. So it's kind of they're at a stalling point where they're like, well, what do we pass on to our children? What do we tell them? So a lot of it is also in that sense of both the development of the characters, the development of the setting. You particularly just have Avery's viewpoint, but then there are a lot of circumstances that you consider as far as how the characters are behaving.
Okay. Let me have this follow up, and then you can have the last five minutes before we take a break for a second and go to our last segment. Okay. I want to come back to the red lipstick. I hear you, right? I hear you. Okay, so I get it when you talk to me about your approach to that scene from the perspective that you tell me. Okay, she's going out. She wants to look nice. She has to pick up these extra shifts. She wants to be greeted well out in the world, right? But I have to say, I would be remiss if I didn't feel like it carried historical baggage with it, right? And what I'm talking about is the numerous novels of the Harlem Renaissance that I've read that depict some Southern peasant taking part in the migration, coming to a place like New York or something, right? Anne Petry's The Street comes to mind right now, right? She has this character in there named Ludi, and the historical understanding that these women migrating during these times, they were forced into subservient and sometimes positions of prostitution, right? Or even worse, they were just regular people who were overdetermined by the society to be prostitutes, right? And so a lot of times the signal to that in the literature was the lipstick and the wearing of the lipstick, particularly the red lipstick. As I look here at my partner, who is beautifully groomed with her red lipstick on today. And I was just wondering, that was one of the reasons why I posed a question about you with regards to tradition earlier, right? I did not know to what extent you were playing with aspects of the tradition, trying to get us as audience members to reconsider approaches to the tradition, or taking advantage of alternative understandings of what things within the tradition could mean, right? And so, not to harp on it too much, because there are certainly some other things that I want to get to about the novel, but just like Granddad handing out country ass whoopings that brought people into being, that turn to the lipstick, particularly after experiencing what she did with Robert, that is bringing her down a peg, it kind of set in my crawl a certain kind of way, and I just wanted your response as to what was going on with it. So thank you. Yeah. As part of my professional studies, I consider myself a medievalist. One of the groups that I interact with on a regular basis is referred to as medievalists of color. Right, and I was particularly taken by the numerous references to the medieval throughout the collection. Right, I mean, even if we start with Conan the Barbarian, you know, barbarians usually are the cause of the Middle Ages in Europe, right? I mean, their storming of the gates in the Roman Empire. But you make references to, you know, being rebel princes, beating down castle walls and going up castle ramparts, and you make references to caliphs and things of this sort. Can you speak to me? Is there any particular interest of yours on the medieval, or how do these allusions to the medieval, how do they make their way into the collection of stories?
The persistence of that imagery is an extended metaphor in the sense that it does two things. It takes us into Avery's inner world as far as the sense of sort of power fantasies he has. Because when you think about medieval times, there was a strict caste structure. And then, you know, across the board, whatever culture you have, so he's kind of looking at in his mind like the extravagance of being at the top of that structure and like what it could be to be there, but then also considering what it would be like to be lower in the structure. Also, it connects to some of the consequences, as in medieval times you think about, you know, chop off his head and stuff like that. So it's a way for him to express or have a metaphor that he can think about consequences he might face. And then also it's part of the setting, and that in the setting that he's in, you know, you might see like a church, and you know the church is vacant, it's no longer used, and it's decayed, so it's just might make you think of like an old castle, or even like the facade of the old bear pits, like the way that is dilapidated, and just, you know, but it looks like a part of a castle. The water
so
tower.
Literally signifying on the ruinedness of the medieval times to a certain extent. Okay. Nick, you were what were you saying earlier?
I wanted to explore the secrets that Black families hold, and that we tend to keep things buried, right? After we didn't realize that. So you always read or Avery always read his uncle's comic books, right? But we didn't learn until later that there was this history of the uncle that he never knew about, right? Or that his mother never let him know about. So there's secrets that Black families hold. And we also were thinking about how the spaces that they lived in were cluttered with those things from the families, like, you know, the basement was cluttered and needed to, when they were cleaned, the back of the lot was cleaned, the inside of the store, especially at the end, you know, was cleaned, and it seemed, what type of effect were you going for, or were you going for an effect at all?
As far as the description of the different artifacts and the different, like, so overall, I was trying to give a sense of the different avenues that families can use to pursue taking that next step as a family, or generating some kind of prosperity or some kind of regularity or balance for their family and then also their community. So you get the sense that if you pull back and you look at the family history from the grandparents to Cheryl and then her brother and then her husband and then to the children, you see that there were lots of different strategies that were employed. And then even specifically that the grandparents, they were trying to be business owners and make what you could call an honest buck. And then at the same time, one of their children decided, like, well, let me try to make money this way. And even in what's described of that character, he wasn't doing it just to do it. He had bigger ideas in mind. And so I think that's something that's true, and I think that's something that's natural as far as to it connects to that sense of folks employing different survival strategies, just to make them from day to day or from year to year, or to lay down a foundation.
Okay. And my last question is, I noticed that what was absent, even then when we usually have a coming of age tale, especially one that explores from, I think he was 9 in the first story to at least about 16. I think I hit 16 somewhere in one of those stories I read. You find boys reckoning with themselves and their own physical bodies. And I noticed that there is a lack of sex in the book, a lack of even interest in any women, men, anything. I think there was one reference to him being the master defiler of sheets or something like that. And I was like, oh, there's one, But other than that, I noticed that it's devoid of sexual references or even him learning his own body.
I in different drafts and different versions, I explored him having romantic relationships or explored different aspects of sexuality. Ultimately, it was a matter of what the focus of the collection would be overall. And so generally, if I'm crafting or if I'm drafting something, I try to focus on the elements that are coming together the best. So I actually had a story, and it's a version of Shine, where Danielle, she's having trouble with her boyfriend, and then Avery's trying to start a relationship with a girl, and it doesn't work out. The only thing there is that it kind of took some of the focus away from the way that the characters were developing, and so it's just it ended up being something that fell out of the scope of the collection. And it also took it in a direction that at the point at which he would be dating, he'd be a little bit older, and then I kind of wanted it to, as his agency widens a little bit more, that the community comes into a little bit more focus. So I felt that if we focused on him having a relationship or him connecting with this new character and a girlfriend, that would take that off course. And I mean, to be honest too, as far as sexuality or romantic relationships, I'm trying to figure out if I have anything really new or interesting to add in that direction. So I was trying to overall play it to my strengths and then also to the strengths of the collection.
Got it. Your turn.
I just have a barrage of notes that I just wanted to hit on. So one of the things I found very interesting in the book was this dichotomy of country versus city aesthetics. Were you trying to do anything with those representations? Because in a certain manner, as I said earlier, I originally came into here privileging grandma and granddad, actually, right? I felt like they were, an earnest representation of the folk. And Nick had asked me earlier, well, what do you think about the Morlocks? And I said, I thought the Morlocks were a contemporary representation of the folk intersected with the plagues of city living, right? And so I look at Robert as somewhere in between, right? Robert could have had some of this sensibility, and maybe he did. Maybe he just applied it in the area in this contemporary time where it wasn't a good fit. I don't know. But at any rate, can you speak on on that kind of country ass whipping versus getting beat up by D or somebody? Can you speak on that country versus city aesthetic that seems to be going on?
Well, that was something that came to me naturally. As far as it's kind of interesting to think of the grandparents. You get the sense that they came from a rural setting at some point, because they're butchering goats, they're fishing, they're owning a general store. So there's a sense that, and they're just a part of the folks who are owning businesses, because at a certain time, there would be a corner store in almost every corner. You go a few blocks over and so on and so forth. And so I was trying to trace the link between where people, maybe they came from like the Great Migration and then settled in St. Louis and then applied some of that sense of being from a more rural area to setting up a foundation in the city and moving forward. And then also specifically, as you're saying, like what that does to a community over time. Like what does that adaptation actually look like? And even, like a sense of, if you were to look at an area in the city in which there were a lot of black-owned corner markets, and then you could come back to that part of the city, like if it was, maybe like 20 years ago or even older, and then if you come back to that part of the city now, you might not find as many of those corner markets. And then it's a curiosity of, what was the next step? If those businesses didn't work out, what happened to the people that owned them? Did they move on to something different? So on and so forth. So that was a conscious attempt for me to try to track that lineage.
You said you were going to run
Okay,
down.
I'll keep going. Some of the language structure I found to just be beautiful. Particularly as I said, a native of St. Louis. I thought this line, the ancient charcoal smoke, it kind of just set on my head, right? I found it hilarious that you talked about hardened lower classness and upper lower classness. One of my friends, I'm a graduate of St. Louis Country Day / Mary Institute St. Louis Country Day School, and there weren't very many black students that went there when I went there, let alone affluent black students that went there. But we had this one friend named Kevin Harrington who stayed on Delmore, right? And he stayed on Delmore up in that enclave around where City Hospital used to be. Or was that City Hospital? What's the name of the hospital over there? At any rate, he stays on Delmore over there by DeBoliver, where there are a few enclaves up in there that were gated, right? And this place that we used to have to pass going to Country Day every day, there would be Upper Ladue and Lower Ladue, right? And so we kidded with Kevin that he lived on Upper Delmore, right? So when I came across this hardened lower classness and this upper lower classness, it just made me think of my childhood even more. Now, we discussed your signifying on, I believe it was the 1949 race riot at Fairgrounds Park. And that was one of the more explicit allusions to history and the references to history in the book. But you did a lot of subtle signifying on historical events, particularly within the black community. I think it was Avery and his grandfather who... I forget what they were searching for, but they were searching for it by the Eads Bridge, which of course made me think of the race riots of East St. Louis in 1917 when so many of our forefathers fled across the Eads Bridge. You had this in response to something. I think they wanted, it was in response to transgressing your mother or somebody, but the thing you said was floating face down in the Mississippi. And that language conjured lynchings for me, that conjured the riots once again, and it took me back to the Mississippi, back to the race riots of 1917, where we had so many bodies in the Mississippi that were found weeks, if not months, after taking place. And earlier, I think I misspoke, it was the MB First Baptist Church that you mentioned in the collected short stories. And doing a little research on that church, I learned that it was once a station for the Underground Railroad, right? So not only did I appreciate the book because it found a way to make productive use of anecdotes from my childhood, but you actually, bring in historical events that are relevant to black folk in this city that may have been forgotten. Was this also an intent on your purpose? Were you trying to make sure that you kept these ideas alive?
Yes, specifically because another thing that I was working with more intentionally is the idea of isolation on a few different levels. So there's isolation with Avery himself and the way you're following him. Then there's isolation between the other characters, and then there's isolation as far as the community away from the rest of the city. And so it's just kind of curious because it's like a lot of the different. So there's like on the corner of North Grand and Natural Bridge, there's an abandoned performing arts high school. And yeah, and they were selling it for something crazy. Like you could buy it for like, I don't want to say $100, but maybe like $10,000. But if you signed a contract where you do a certain amount of upkeep. But I was in that area and I was, just walking around and looking at it. Sometimes it's like something you pass by so many times you forget about it. But then you come back and you look at it and you wonder about it. Like, this is a nice place. A lot of good work must have happened here. And then it's in the state of disrepair. You kind of are curious about what happened, and you're also curious about what can you do to preserve the history there. And so I would wager to reckon that as far as that a lot of the artifacts and some of the important monuments and just important buildings and important historical events that happen in that area, that they're things that a lot of folks outside of the area don't tend to think about, or even within the area you could. So, for me, if I walk past the old water tower or something like that, I just think like, oh, it's an old water tower. It would be easy for me to just to forget about it and not think about what it was and what it actually means until later, So it is kind of an effort that I do want at least somewhere where these monuments can have some kind of prominence.
Well, for our audience, what does the water tower mean? For those who are maybe not from here.
So for me specifically, and I guess like I'll start from like the standpoint of maybe some kind of emotional resonance. Like I was saying earlier, I like the viewpoint of if I'm driving toward where I grew up, kind of the water tower kind of breaks the horizon. And it's something like, so it's something I'll, see from an early age. So it's just like, if you have a landscape where there aren't too many points of interest and you see this huge stone water tower, it's almost like, it's just a powerful thing to look at. It's also...
What I meant was historically. What does it actually historically represent?
Well, so at some point, and I don't have the background details off the top of my head, but at some point it was the fact that the water tower was being built in the area is whenever the neighborhood was up and coming. And so then that's the main sense that I'm drawing off of, is that it's one of, is it 4 water towers throughout the city?
That is the only water tower that I am aware of. Right, like that is the water tower. I'm not aware of the history of water towers in St. Louis, right? So I have no idea. You're talking to the wrong person.
I heard, or maybe I'm wrong, but I heard that they used to auction off slaves there.
I have, perhaps we can.
They had when we had that 250 where they had the cakes everywhere around town. There was a cake there, and I was wondering what had happened, and someone told me that they used to auction off slaves there.
It would not shock me at all, but like this is why we need more literary works like Avery Coat is a snake, a thief, a liar, because we need discussion like this out in the public sphere. I am remiss to say that as a historian, St. Louis has not been my scholarly focus, right? It's only been my hobby because I am a native here. But perhaps this is something that could be tabled for further episodes, discussion of certain historical monuments and so on around St. Louis, because I am just as ignorant of their significance as the next person, and for that I'm a bit ashamed. All right. But I mean, in my time, the water tower has always, basically been a landmark.
Yeah.
A landmark, particularly in people's lives, right? Like my family used to live at Aubert and over there at Aubert off of Grand, right? Like right in behind, 2 blocks in behind the water tower.
Mm-hmm.
So it has that landmark in my family lineage, but what it ever meant, how it was ever used, I'm not aware of it being in functional use during my lifetime, right? So it really it's this kind of beacon to a certain time and a certain place in one's life. Ladies and gentlemen, that is it. We do want to thank you very much,
Yes,
my
I
friend, for
appreciate
joining
it.
us today.
Such a nice explication of
on
your
this,
novel. Thank you.
on this
Thank you.
inaugural venture of Lit Discussions. We thank you for being very, very patient.